Voter suppression is a main vehicle of Republican power and dominance in American politics. The one smart move that Democrats in the House have announced in the past couple of days after the decent results in the midterm elections is that they're going to be calling for national voting rights legislation. The only smart and necessary move so far. Voter suppression, of course, has a profound and continuous history of this in this country. For most of our history, of course, people of color and women were not allowed to vote, period. Non-landowning whites were not allowed to vote for quite some time as well. And going back to the 2000 election, where George W. Bush won an election that he lost with the assistance of the Supreme Court, it defines the politics of our modern era. I want to take a brief trip down memory lane here and be what I would call necessarily petty. This is a clip from the day after the 2000 election. The election, of course, was in dispute, and the Bush campaign, along with his brother, the then governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, and the highly crazy Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, were setting about a strategy to make sure not all votes were counted in Florida, just as Rick Scott and DeSantis are attempting to do in Florida today. And this is a then Congressman, Joe Scarborough, not a member of the hashtag resistance, not a Starbucks swilling egomaniac, but a Gingrich Republican egomaniac.
How many dead men voted in Florida yesterday, and how do we know?
I can report to you, and I've got the information here, that all the dead men and all the convicted felons voted for Bob Wexler. And I think you got like 75%. Congratulations on that, by the way. Those are two good constituencies. But you know, again,
Bill,
you could say this about any state. But let's just wait and see how it returns.
I was beginning, Joe, to respect your demeanor because this is a serious issue. Let's not play politics and let's not play games.
I was just joking with you, Bob. Don't lose your sense of humor tonight.
Lesson: Joe Scarborough, obviously always a dick. But in fact, the Republicans were always playing politics and always playing games, which is how they steal elections. Let's talk about some of those politics and games. In Georgia, Jack Kemp, the Secretary of State, oversaw his own election. He halted 53,000 voter registrations. 70% of those were likely people of color using a faulty auto match system. On the day of voting, he accused Democrats of hacking his campaign without any evidence, a tactic he's used before in the past. He purged many off of the voter rolls. Along with that, there were significant errors and lines at the polls and the shutting down of polling stations, all in a concerted effort to block mainly people of color from voting for his opponent, or voting generally, in fact. In North Dakota, there was an attack on Native American voters upheld in the Supreme Court by an empowered Republican majority with Brett Kavanaugh. A new voter ID law in North Dakota required a residential address, and many Native Americans who reside in reservations use P.O. boxes. Therefore, they were unable to vote. In Florida, we're going into a mandatory recount. Rick Scott, without a shred of evidence, has accused Democrats of attempting to steal the election. In Broward County, a largely Democratic county, around 25,000 votes were counted as blank for the Senate race, a significant number. Some believe that this was because the ballot line for the Senate race was placed underneath a long list of text obscuring the place to vote. Florida Senator Nelson's lawyers have contended that machine errors caused many of these votes not to be counted. And there were significantly other irregularities in Florida. Voters fortunately voted to restore the voting rights of felons, but they were not restored in time for this election. Voter suppression is something the left needs to take seriously, because fundamentally we are talking about democracy in the fullest sense. And we are talking about the capacity to build a left coalition, which will rest on the ability of everyone to participate in a political process, whether, of course, we're talking about the right of assembly, the right to protest, longer-term organizing, but certainly also the right to vote. The Republican Party has presided over a strategic assault on access, gerrymandering. The Roberts Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Voter ID laws and added restrictions on voting target people of color and young people. And even in Democratic-controlled areas like New York, the ballot has plenty of problems, and there are serious difficulties in voting and reforms that are necessary. Along with attempts to suppress the vote, we've allowed our electoral infrastructure to crumble. Every election, we hear stories of untrained poll workers providing faulty information, major issues with polling machines, which is, by the way, we're predominantly controlled by, predominantly controlled by 3 private companies. That's right, 3 private companies own most of the voting machines we're voting on. We need to fix election laws so we can vote in a orderly, universal, and civil rights guaranteed manner. The structure of our political system has a significant bent against people. We have all know about how the Electoral College, of course, has led to 2 Republican presidents becoming president while losing a majority of the votes since 2000. We also know that the power of the Senate is entirely disproportionate between populations and favors smaller, whiter, more rural states dominated by even more narrow corporate interests. In 2000, the election in Florida was no doubt compromised by electoral practices and a Supreme Court that literally invoked the 14th Amendment, one guaranteeing civil rights, one guaranteeing equal rights under the law, a prime force of civil rights and equality in this country, something that Republicans on the court have done everything to undermine. They used to suggest that a lack of uniformity in voting standards would violate George W. Bush's civil rights under the 14th Amendment. This is literally the case they wrote. They also wrote in the case, the 5-4 Republican majority, that the reasoning in this case should not be used for further cases. This was a one-off to steal a presidential election. And of course, this is a country where political and economic decisions are often made by people who are unaccountable to the public will. This fight against voter suppression and for true equality in the voting process is inseparable from a broader struggle for economic democracy and broader stakeholder equality and justice across the country. We know that in order to get people out and in order to sustain the types of victories we're talking about, we need more people engaged. Republicans know that too, and that's why they've set out strategically and relentlessly to limit that engagement. And that's why it's entirely inseparable from the Trump administration's ethnic cleansing of America through its immigration policies. It's entirely inseparable from the conspiracy theory right-wing nutosphere of voter fraud and a broader effort to close, limit, and block democracy, indeed to put democracy in chains so that capitalism can be unbridled with zero accountability. A fight for voting rights can be the first step into a broader fight for true democracy, where people have not only the ability to exercise their vote in the political and civic sphere, but in the economic one as well. Let's get to it. All right, guys, anything you want to add in on this as we return?
Yeah, I would just add that there's a very significant political opportunity that we have here on the left to make these contradictions very clear. And that if we're supposed to be a democracy, if we're supposed to be a country that's ruled by the will of the people, making that demand that the people's voice isn't being heard, making the point that the voting system is ridiculously difficult, there's impediments, and there are outright attempts to steal elections in this country is a really great wedge issue in the United States. And more in this country, people are feeling more and more powerless and more feeling that we are living in a crisis of democracy. It's very clear that the answer to the crisis of democracy is more democracy. And to make that demand very clear, that like the founding myths and the founding ideas of this country, that we say, wait a second, these are not being held up as the left, and that we make those demands to extend like the glorious ideas of a republic or a democracy into their actual form, rather than the kind of very plutocratic system that has been developed over the past 200 years.
Right, and don't concede. Pussy Al Gore. Matt.
I would like to co-sign Griscom's comments on the extension of those liberties that we at least say we agree with. Also, I'm just struck with seeing young Joe Scarborough like that, and thinking of all of the sort of younger conservatives that I've been harassing on Twitter for the last 3 years, and knowing that in 10 years from now they're going to be invited into probably cable shows to ask, be like, oh, well, Florida's gone now. What does that mean for the GOP? I'll be like, well, I think we need to do this and that, and act like responsible adults. I mean, man, it's
right. The same people are getting their start now, posting 4chan memes,
Kavanaugh,
and supporting fascism.
Kavanaugh was in the Brooks Brothers riot.
Explain the Brooks Brothers riot.
Oh, I can't.
I should say this: we are preparing an illicit history, which is going to drop soon for patrons on the Florida election and what put George W. Bush in office. And if you look at it objectively, people use, I think now it's becoming more widespread, right? Samantha Power even said, if I was ambassador to the United Nations and someone gave me the conditions of voting in Georgia about, a foreign country, I would demand that there be hearings on it, right? Now, of course, she might add if they were also not an ally of the United States, but whatever. That being said, that's become sort of more broadly recognized. But if you go back to Florida, the fact that this happened in front of all of us in a way that was an objective, a presidential candidate's brother presides over a state where there's a disputed election. It's clear from all indications that if all ballots were voted clearly and fairly, Al Gore would be president, would win Florida. The ballot counting is stopped by a Supreme Court who is a supposedly conservative states' rights court, overruling a state court in Florida, evoking the 14th Amendment, which they always don't want to use for anything substantive. Of course, would never want to use that for civil rights, to stop a vote count in its tracks so that George W. Bush is installed as president. And of course, 16 years later or 18 years later can be seen dancing with Ellen DeGeneres. With a couple of global invasions, torture regimes, economic meltdown, environmental catastrophe, and Katrina thrown in between. And that's how we do things.
Yeah.
And that's also why fuck Joe Scarborough and have a little bit of historical awareness, people.
Yeah, these people are bad for their whole lives, turns out. It's just some other, I think there's a few more people in this Brooks Brothers riot, but Roger Stone, of course.
Roger Stone,
Matt Schlapp, who
Matt Schlapp.
Yeah,
Wow.
we had on the list a Mercedes Schlapp. His wife is also a RNC person, and I think those people are, I get a strong Nazi vibe from them. Like the way he was talking to Michael Steele about how he should accept being called that he was just RNC chair because he was black.
Yeah, it's like, why are you so offended?
Yeah, he was. But anyway, yeah, that's what struck me is these people, they last, and then they just mature into apparently respectable parts of our media environment.
That's exactly right.